Thanks, Peter. Look, yes, I too want to kick off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders of the Gadigal people, elders past and present. I do want to acknowledge that I have been doing this occasionally this year. I want to acknowledge that this year marks the 50th year of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy outside of Old Parliament House. 50 years continuously, Australia's First Nation people have demonstrated their right to have a voice to Parliament. And the mob that we have in government now will not entertain that at all. They will not, they don't acknowledge the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which my union, the Teachers Federation, does. And they are absolutely opposed. This current federal Liberal coalition government is opposed to a voice in Parliament and a treaty with First Nations people and commencing truth-telling. This year, very soon, marks also a federal election. And it is my hope and many thousands of other people's hope that this year we can throw out this rabble government and replace them with a government who has a commitment. Sure, we need to keep working toward keeping them working towards the aim, but we need to replace this rabble with a government, however it is made up, of people who are committed to enshrining a voice for Indigenous, our First Nations people into Parliament. 50 years is too long, and it needs to change. I do want to apologise, Peter. I have not prepared for today's conversation as well as I would have liked to, but that makes me no different to any one of the 60,000 members of the Teachers Federation. We are exhausted. Some are past exhaustion. If you just look at what has been thrown upon us for these last 2 years with COVID. Now, I could go way back, I'd like to go back 10 years. For 10 years we've been saying to this government in all public sectors that they have to stop the incessant cuts of budgets, cuts of people, cuts of jobs. For 10 years we've been saying that the cuts are too severe in education, in all forms of education, from early childhood through to our school system, TAFE and universities. They have cut too deeply in our education, in all of our education, in all of our health services, in all of our community services, housing, and down to public transport. I mean, the debacle in Sydney with the public transport came as no surprise to me when I saw that David Elliott was the minister with carriage of that. The very man who sacked all of the highly qualified teachers in corrective services, sacked them. With the reasoning for sacking 126 highly skilled adult educators in our prison system was that he couldn't understand why you needed to be a qualified teacher to teach prisoners to read and write.
Good grief.
His mum got together the Mothers Club to help him to read. So, you know, this is how they make policy, apparently, this rabble, both state and federal. They are clinging on to an ideology of small government, which means no government, which means government's not providing services. And they were not providing services well and truly to the point 2 years ago, COVID occurs. We don't have the depth in our schools to replace teachers when they're on leave generally, but throw in COVID, and it's impossible. I have flippantly been walking around my office saying to people every day when I get a new information that somebody's got COVID, somebody's isolating, it's happening everywhere, but it's happening more so with people who hang around with children. My advice to people is just don't hang around with children. You're less likely to get COVID if you're not hanging around with children. That is what we do. We hang around with children, and we know, therefore, that we are at greater risk. It's at least the first hour is. I'm going to defer to current teachers in the room, but I'm from anecdotally from the information that we're getting at Federation is at least the first hour of every day is taken up with the school executive just moving classes and teachers and resources around so that there is not large groups of students without an adult in front of them. At least an hour, it's fair to say. So in some schools it's more than that. So every day starts with this huge problem solving and some problems that can't be solved because there's just not enough teachers that are available. And one of the reasons that there isn't is that the profession has not remained attractive to people, that as budgets are cut, there are less people to do the same, to maintain the same quality that we always had. And nobody goes to work, no matter what your employment, nobody walks into work saying, well, today I think I'll just be mediocre. And contrary, thanks Stuart, contrary to what that awful man is, a senator, is he not, who said that the problem with the public education system is dubbed teachers. Contrary to, I didn't want to use the bastard's name really, we all know who he is, terribly unattractive man that he is. The reason that the education system, apparently, that all the problems are because of dud teachers. Well, it's not dud teachers, it's dud governments. Yay. Is what it is. I'm not one who uses numbers and statistics very often, but these are frightening, and so I will. 53% of full-time teachers in New South Wales worked an average of 60 hours or more a week. 53%. That means that some are working way more than 60 hours a week. Look, the average, it gets too shocking. It seriously gets too shocking. 75% of teachers say the workload is too high and the wages too low, and that's why they're thinking of leaving. When asked in a survey, this is from 2018, from 2018 some of these figures, they would be even worse in 2022. 62% of workers in the public education system are not securely employed. They are employed in any other fashion other than permanent. 62%. It's outrageous. And when Rob comes to talk about TAFE, Rob would say we'd love to have 62% of people in insecure work in TAFE because it's way higher than that. So you're in insecure work. You believe that you are never going to get a permanent job in a desirable area, and even in desirable areas. In Sydney, we can't get teachers for permanent positions. because people just are saying, I'll vote with my feet and I'll leave the profession. They're leaving the profession because our wages have not kept up with everyone else's, with our other professionals. No public sector wage has kept up with other professionals because of the state federal government's wages cap. Now, if the federal government, who is, and I know I'm way off track here, but I'll come back to where I need to be, but the federal government is one of the largest employers, the state government, the government is one of the largest employers in New South Wales, and they are modelling constantly don't give wage rises, constantly. Small wage rises or none at all. Remember, Gladys wanted everyone to have no wage rise for 12 months and then 0.03, which is no wage rise, we know that. If the largest and the government employer is modelling that, so do other employers. And so nobody in New South Wales has had a decent wage increase. In fact, I go so far as to say no one in Australia has had, no worker in Australia has had a decent pay increase for the last 6 or 7 years. We are all struggling, but those in the public sector even more so. And now for teachers, with the demands being put upon them constantly, and with that they can see that they are skilled and they're highly educated and can work elsewhere, why would they stay? The Department of Education, and I will read this because these are quotes from the Department of Education's own reports. They know that, and this is a quote, teachers must feel respected and supported if they are to act as ambassadors for their profession. While teachers have public trust, they do not feel supported by their employer. This is a report to the damned employer. Extrinsic benefits within teaching do not attract new teachers as graduates. They see low potential for income growth. We need to acknowledge that the current experience on some dimensions is not always compelling. That's my favourite. It's not always compelling. I could go on and on and on, but basically we know that the public holds teachers and nurses currently during this COVID crisis in high esteem. We know it anecdotally, and we know it by research that the various unions have undertaken. And yet, we have a grub politician out in public calling the public system, the public system teachers, duds. They're out of touch. They are totally out of touch. This government is, both state and federal, are completely out of touch with what the general public believes. The general public is behind teachers and nurses, and by golly, also retail workers. You know, at last, retail and hospitality workers are treated with respect, at last. May it always continue? I think it won't, but I'm not here to speak on behalf of retail workers or hospitality workers. For our members, for the New South Wales Teachers Federation members, Friday, we had about 200 teaching principals come to a conference at Federation, and I've never seen them so angry. By definition, principals, school principals are supposedly a fairly conservative lot. One or two might not be, but generally conservative lot, and they're ready to down tools and just walk off the job. Just down tools and walk off the job. They're ready to do that. The principals. We took industrial action, and it was well received by the public, and a lot of our members made their way to Sydney to show their support. The nurses have done the same, and I believe are going to do the same again. There is a culture of we've had enough. a principal said to me on Friday, you know, 2-3 years ago, I would have said it feels hopeless. Now, I'm just angry and I want to voice that anger. It can't stay as it is. This principal's saying the system cannot stay as it is, and it is not fair to the next generation of young people. I think I'm running out of time, but a whole different debate, a whole different dimension that we need to think about is what has this disruption done to this generation of young people? It scares me. We won't know the answer for at least 20 or 30 years. What scares me is that some kids can't get back to school. They don't want to go back to school. And it is disruptive, and so why bother? My concern then also leads on to the loss of skills and trades that we have in Australia. My concern that if kids drop out of school, there is no TAFE system for them to go to now. So how are they going to finish their school, and what are they going to do? How is this current generation going to end up? I don't know. It's scary to think about it. But if we constantly belt around the head and call names, the very people who are caring for the younger generation right now, their teachers and the health people who work in the health system, what hope is there for those young people? I guess the only thing that I can say to leave on a note of some sort of hope is that those of us who do work directly with young people now, those of us in the education system, we've had enough, and we're standing up for this generation and the next generations, and we're telling them that. They are seeing that we care about them, that we want the best for them, we want the best and the best to stay in the system, not to leave it. And look, I genuinely think we are so angry that we will keep fighting in all means possible until we win. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Of course, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. And, I always try to reflect, as others do, on acknowledging the traditional owners. And for us as healthcare workers, the obvious thing is the gap, the huge gap between life expectancy of white Anglo-Saxon Australians and the Indigenous people of this land. It remains a massive problem in this country. We all must do more to rectify that. And again, it's federal government and is not the way forward. When I was asked to talk on healthcare and the COVID recovery, I sort of struggled with the framing of it. And it's sort of reassuring listening to Maxine that the sort of structure of what I'm about to say is very much the same as what Maxine just talked about. I know where I want to end up. I want to end up with this nice big rallying call that there can be hope, that there will be change in the future, but how do we get there? And as Maxine touched on, what we know, no matter which country you are in, what we know is that what pulls societies through is a robust public service system. Whether it's education, sanitation, water, prisons, healthcare, whatever it is, it's the public sector that provides best for its communities. And so what you want is a strong, resilient public sector working for its community. The question is, do we have that at the moment? And if not, why not? So I want to talk a little bit about healthcare globally. And when I'm talking about healthcare, I'm not just focusing on public sector here, but also aged care and primary healthcare. And, one of the things that we hold dear in this country is Medicare. And we look to the UK and we look to the NHS and this theory of universal healthcare, that you can access healthcare with little financial hardship as possible. And it's a dream that just has not been achieved globally at all. at all. And here in Australia, we're seeing it slip away. I think the aspiration of Medicare to provide healthcare free at the point of delivery has long gone for most people. In Australia, the cost of accessing healthcare means more and more people are missing out. There's a US-based organisation called the Commonwealth Fund, and every year they put out a report on the top 11 economies' healthcare status. Now, obviously, they're advocating for public healthcare in the US, so they've got a certain lens. But they look at the top 11, and Australia ranks number 3 in that ranking, and in some of the aspects they rank number 1. So equity and also in administrative efficiency, right? So when you've got a beast like Medicare, that's really efficient, so that makes sense. But for affordability, we're 8th and we're slipping. We're 8th and we're slipping. And what their recent studies showed is that the 24% of low income and 19% of high income people reported cost-related access issues in Australia. So that's 1 in 4 workers, or 1 in 5 rich workers, struggle to go and see a doctor, get their prescription filled, or go and see a specialist, or they miss some sort of treatment because of cost-related impact. So that's the reality of our brilliant Medicare system, an increasingly user-pays system. So we are seeing this approach of user-pays both at the federal and the state system. And you've got to ask why we're seeing this. And the ABC put out this brilliant graph it's a bit old now, 2019, but it showed the ASX and the gains in the ASX in 2019 compared to the global financial crisis in 2005. And what it showed is that for most areas of the stock exchange, they were still flatlining even in 2019, except for healthcare, which had gone up 250%. Because globally, healthcare is the area you can start to make profit, whether it's aged care, primary care, or acute care. And it's not wages that are going up. It's not wages of workers that's increasing the cost of healthcare, right? It's the cost of the medicines, it's the cost of the equipment that's really pushing that up. And so what we can see is that neoliberalism, just like it's hitting education, it's really hitting our dream of universal healthcare. Like I said, privatisation is rife, and the biggest impact you've seen in New South Wales is the privatisation of aged care. We have the most exposed aged care system in the entire country as far as private for-profit and not-for-profit operators are concerned. And what we see is that 90%, over nearly 99% by the time you take in the pension and everything else, 99% of their financing comes from our taxes. And report after report after report has shown that through tax avoidance processes, all of that's been channelled into private shareholder wealth or the wealth and structure of the for-profits. Uniting Care, who says they can't afford to feed their residents and can't afford to pay their staff, we're actually investing in for-profit aged care facilities in China with the money that they're making out of the Australian system. So this is neoliberalism ripping away. And in New South Wales, we're seeing a lot of privatisation, particularly in renal services, palliative care and cancer services. So these are the big profit areas now in healthcare. But the big tragedy of that is that once again we see the public sector propping up the private wealth that's being generated out of this, because the private insurance rebate scheme is what keeps the private health insurance system alive and well in Australia, and that in turn keeps the private system ticking along. So what we see is a massive shift of Commonwealth, our taxes, being shifted into private wealth through the healthcare system. And again, we have the free market to thank for that, and we have really strong tools at their behest that are backing that up. The free trade agreements that keep screwing us over, and the tax system that I talked about. So it's no wonder then that we don't have a robust public healthcare system in New South Wales or Australia, and this is the thing that is undermining it. And this leads us to that question of how is healthcare positioning us for a COVID recovery. And the truth of the matter is that the public health system, particularly in New South Wales, I can vouch for, is absolutely exhausted and is not coping despite the Premier's assurances that it is. And again, I want to reference, as Maxine did, the New South Wales government's salaries cap and what's that done over the last 10 years. So the last 10 years, nurses and midwives in this state have been arguing for shift-by-shift ratios, and the government keeps saying no, it's against our 2.5 policy cap. What they've said to nurses and midwives over these 10 years, Dad, is that if you want the people of New South Wales to have a better healthcare system, you'll have to trade in your overtime, you'll have to trade in your shift penalties, you'll have to trade in your shoe and sock allowance. And the nurses have just refused to do that, and rightly so. And what that's meant is that nurses are leaving the industry just as they are teachers. We have seen that the most senior nurses are either retiring early. We had 500 more nurses retire last year than average, and we are seeing senior nurses drop down from full-time to permanent part-time as a coping mechanism. If you read the Telegraph, which I never do because it's Murdoch Press, but I get the clippings, they reported today the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder on nurses and midwives in the public health system. One report showed 70% of nurses are showing the physical signs of anxiety post-dealing with COVID. And how did our government treat our members during the original COVID impact and then Delta and Omicron? Our union had to fight the right for nurses to have P2 N95 masks, fit tested to go to work. We were being called up daily by nurses saying, I don't have a mask and they're ordering me into the COVID ward, what do I do? This was the treatment that they were getting. So it's no wonder that they've got PTSD. We shouldn't have had to fight for those masks, but we did. And the reason we had to fight for them was scarcity. It's because of the manufacturing system, it's because of just-in-time delivery. It meant that across the community, there simply weren't enough masks in this country. And so the nurses and midwives were sacrificial lambs in many respects. So you've got low wages, really poor working conditions, people walking out the door, and staffing levels just plummeting. And again, this is why nurses and midwives took to the streets on the 15th of February. Over 8,000 nurses and midwives across New South Wales went out on strike, and they are voting and have voted to walk out again on the 31st of March. And the problem is that the government thinks that it's all about money. The government thinks that what they can do is offer something above the 2.5%, and that will make the nurses and midwives happy. That they are completely disconnected, as Maxine said. It's not about the money, it's actually about the staffing. It's about their quality of work. It's about them knowing that they can go home, knowing that they've provided the people of New South Wales a quality public health system. But I have hope, I have a lot of hope. Our members are fighting like never before. When we looked at the crowd on the 15th of February, there were so many young nurses and midwives in that crowd. They are there and they are fighting for their future. We know we can win, we know we must win, and we beat this government before. When they tried to privatise hospitals, we smashed them. And they failed on all 5 occasions. But we did that with the community, which is why I want to finish with saying that the nurses and midwives will be out again on the 31st of March. We need the community to come and join us again. We won't stop until we've won, and increasingly we'll be relying on comrades like yourselves to stand shoulder to shoulder on the streets. So I look forward to seeing you there.
Okay, let's keep revving up then. I really appreciate being on the same stage with Michael and Maxine. School teachers, nurses have absolutely, when we talk about frontline during COVID, have absolutely been hammered by the lack of support, the lack of funding, and an incredibly difficult process of dealing with a pandemic when you're in the front line, dealing with school students and public hospitals. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about what has happened for TAFE students, vocational education students, and what's happened for their teachers during this period as well, because again, they've been in the front line of this. So what I want to talk about is I want to talk about what's COVID been doing to the students over this period of time and where we go in the future. What's happened to TAFE teachers over this time and the support, and very similar stories in relation to what's happened with school teachers and nurses. We have had a huge number of dropouts, incredibly, really difficult to get recruitment of TAFE teachers, those things, and I'll talk a bit more about that. I just will go briefly into, because we've got two critical things coming up. We've got a federal election coming up in May, a New South Wales state election in March next year. We've got two incredibly important issues to deal with in relation to TAFE and what the policy's doing. I want to spend a bit of time talking about what's happened to students in corrective services, prisoners in corrective services, and what's happening to their education during this period. And again, it relates back to what Michael and Maxine were saying, this push to privatise is also in the jails, and Maxine mentioned it earlier in relation to the Minister for Corrective Services, who's now a dud, I think that might be the word of today, who is a dud in relation to, he's the Minister for Public Transport at the moment as well. I will talk about, it's really important for us to talk about the industrial climate that teachers are in at the moment. And a common statement is made, but it's true, that the teachers' working conditions are the students' learning conditions. There's no doubt about that. And it's important over this next 6 months that we can continue to reinforce that. As Michael said, this is not nurses looking for a pay rise. This is nurses looking for an improvement to public health, an improvement to public hospitals. School teachers are arguing exactly the same stuff in relation to we need more than thanks. And TAFE teachers also are looking for improvements in the way that we can educate our students. So what's COVID done to students? Well, I'm going to give you one really quick line. It is force them online. Even if they don't want to be online, just force them online. School teachers the same have been forced to go online. Now that's changed, but guess what? They realised during this period that that was a cheap way to deliver education for vocational education, and they're not letting go of it. The managers and the politicians who are now running TAFE are not letting go of that, and it's a real struggle at the moment. Because there is definitely advantages to online learning. There's no doubt about that. But I was talking to a teacher at Ultimo TAFE. I'm not going to use any names or disciplines because I don't want to identify anyone. But he said how fantastic it was to have all the class back in the classroom and a meaningful discussion in a theory class. This is not, they say, oh, well, theory can all be done online. He said, no, this was absolutely, it was so good after 2 years to have a meaningful discussion where the students were able to relate what was going on in the workplace to what's going on in the theory, and that's what vocational education is about. It's about being able to give students time, and I'll talk a little bit about that attack rather now, about giving students time to learn their trade or their skill or their profession outside of the pressures of work. And we're losing that at the moment too, and I'll talk a bit more about that. So the idea of practice within vocational education is absolutely critical, and that takes time, and that's what's being taken away from students by forcing them online. More than ever, I'm not sure, I have talked to school teachers about this problem as well, but I think more than ever, teenage up to their 20s, learning online has exposed that the gap in relation to access to internet, hardware, software, those areas. That gap that has occurred is being explained to me so many times by students and teachers. Mostly, and I'll talk a little bit about apprentices, mostly about apprentices are basically working off their phone. They don't have access at work to a computer. They rarely have access at home to decent internet and hardware. And TAFE more and more are pushing stuff downline, which is a big data, big videos, all that sort of stuff, and it's not appropriate for a number of the students that are being forced, as I said, online. But it's not just apprentices. So the way we're funded at the moment, this makes me so angry, because I know how important language literacy and numeracy is in relation to a foundation for vocational education. Most of the focus when people talk about vocational education would see it as a carpenter learning how to hang a door, an electrician learning how to run a light switch. Those are sort of the things that people focus on. They don't understand the background of supporting those tradespeople or supporting other students in language literacy and numeracy to get to the point where they understand what that is. And more now, that process is being undermined. We are having a huge amount of trouble getting teachers who want to teach in language literacy and numeracy at TAFE because it's been undermined so much. Most of the, when we talk about casualisation, I haven't got a figure, but just anecdotally, 90% of teachers teaching language, literacy and numeracy are casual, short-term contracts. It's a disgrace. That skill is absolutely fundamental in relation to having a successful vocational education system. And the way that it's funded now, there used to be a process where you were able to keep on funding certain students at certain levels where they didn't have to progress until they were ready to progress. But now, because of the way the funding works, if you don't progress quickly enough under this, it's called smart and skilled, which is pretty ironic, isn't it? If you don't progress fast enough within what the accountant says, we're going to only pay this much money for this amount of time, well, you then have to drop out. Because if you want to come back, we're going to charge you $3,000 to go to do that little level again. And the teachers in vocational education, literacy and numeracy, as many times as they can, are trying to get around that system, but it is almost getting impossible where these students are having to drop out at a literacy level that is not really where they want to be and will not assist them to get to the next level of education or the next level of promotional opportunity in their job. I'll give you another example of what's going on in practical. So up the North Coast at the moment, and everyone knows I don't have to give any stories about what's happening up in Lismore and stuff. So what's happening right now, there's a trade, again I'm not going to identify it, there's a trade that the students right now should be in their practical classroom. But again, because of what happened with COVID and this push now to get more and more students to go online for a longer period of time than was previously required, those students are not back in the classroom this term. They have been told that the first year apprentices, you have to stay online. Now, can you imagine you're the first year apprentice and you say to the boss, oh look, TAFE's giving me these assignments to do, would it be alright if I just I'll just go and sit in the back there and do my assignments? A first year apprentice. There's no way they're going to do that. So if they're going to do it at all, they're going to be doing it outside their work hours. Now that's fundamental. I'm going to give you a little story of how we won that. It wasn't me, but I'm going to tell you how we won. We called it day release from work to allow students to learn. It was about back in the 1960s. It was the BWIU, Building Workers Industrial Unit. They campaigned for 20 years. I know we've heard this story before. I'm going to say it again, as long as you don't hear it 3 times already. They campaigned for about 20 years to get apprentices time to learn off the job. I don't think I need to explain to you why we need that, and then why it's worked so well ever since they won it. So for 20 years they were campaigning, and of course the bosses don't want that. The bosses want the apprentice, particularly the young apprentice who are cheap, on the job 5 days a week to do all the jobs that you really don't want to do. And there is lots of stories about how first year apprentices get treated. I won't get into that. Anyway, so it came to a point where this is about the early 1960s, and the wives, and they were wives, all the apprentices were blokes, I'm not being sexist, that was just a reality in the early 60s. The wives of the apprentices said, we've had enough. We've had enough of this. They're working 5 days a week, they get home exhausted, they're going to go and do overtime on Saturday, and then they sleep all Sunday. We've had enough of this. And then they've got to go to tech back then on Wednesday and Thursday night, or Tuesday and Wednesday and Friday night. We've had enough of this. So they ran a campaign that said the day is for tech and the night is for love. And they campaigned on it. There's a photo down the CNNNEU office, and it's got a poster of the wives of the apprentices marching with that slogan, and that was the turning point for carpenters. Were the first ones to get what they call day release. And that day release is they could go to tech during the day and learn whilst getting paid. Now I'm going to really horrendous story for you. So you know about the bushfires in 2019-20 down the south coast. They have to rebuild, those communities down there have to rebuild 2,000 houses. They need them now. It will take at least 10 years to build 2,000 houses. There's a company, these dodgy brothers, duds, who are down there, who are saying to the employer, and again I won't mention any names, they are saying to the employer, you keep your apprentice on the job 5 days a week. We will come once a term once every couple of weeks, we'll come and assess them on the job so you can keep them there. So that sounds good for the employer, right? That sounds like a good thing. So they were meant to go, and that's all they had to do. They had to get a person in a car with a phone and go to work sites and assess them. Well, guess what? They didn't even do that. There's a fourth-year apprentice who has contacted us through their union and said, 2 years of my assessments have not been recorded, and guess what? This dodgy private for-profit company is out on broke, and this student can never get access to those results ever again. The results are now gone. That person should be now a tradesperson. TAFE is working there as hard as they possibly can to try and work out how they can then recognise the skills of that person so that they can become. But it's a very difficult thing for TAFE, because if this person wasn't even able to record their assessments, how can you trust that person was actually witnessing and assessing that assessment, that person could hang a door? And we're talking about these apprentices are down on the south coast building houses that were destroyed in the fire, and we've got creeps, private for-profiteers, running around exploiting that. And that is a real lesson in relation to what's happened to vocational education. It has come in and these profiteers have just been sucking what we call cherry-picking the really easily profitable jobs and leaving the difficult stuff to TAFE, and that's exactly what's happening down there now. I talked to the head teacher of carpentry at Nara. He is just absolutely beside himself trying to sort out how he's got a number of these students who were getting assessed by this dodgy company, trying to assess them so that they can get accredited for their course, and then of course they get a higher pay. If they get their trade certificate, they get a higher pay. So let's talk about the dodges in corrective services. And this again just boils my blood in relation to this. So as Maxine introduced before, there was 158 permanent, highly qualified adult educators working in New South Wales prisons, doing an amazing job. I haven't got enough time to tell you how difficult that work is, how difficult it is to encourage basically a very highly illiterate cohort. I think, Stuart, would we say 80% of inmates are basically illiterate? Yeah, 80%. So the importance of having literacy and numeracy teachers in every jail is absolutely essential. Well, this jerk, as Maxine said, sorry, Dud's the word, isn't it? Dud this week. Minister Elliott, he came in and sacked 138 of the 158 adult educators, literacy, numeracy, IT, and there was a lot of art and music teachers as well, which was really important. Art and music was absolutely essential to encourage inmates to get into education, because that was a door into making them feel comfortable. A number of them told me that in prison there's a reluctance to go to education for a number of reasons, but one because they had a bad experience in their earlier education. And to expose yourself as a 30-year-old man who can't read or a woman who can't read was difficult. So what's happened in COVID with that? So you would think this would be an absolutely essential time where inmates would have time to learn during this past. Well, this dud, Elliott, sacked all the teachers, privatised it, and when COVID hit, there was a whole series, just like in the rest of the community, a whole series of lockdowns in the prison system. And the workers in the prison system did an amazing job keeping COVID out, eh? When you look at overseas, once COVID got into prison, it was just there forever. You could never get out. So the work that the workers did, and that was, workers putting up with RAT tests every morning, PCRs twice a week, isolating for 14 days, all of that stuff that workers did in the New South Wales prisons, keeping the prison system healthy, prisoners healthy, and also their co-workers was invaluable. But part of that was that they excluded people, they excluded visitors, they excluded subcontractors. So guess what? Well, some of the teachers from they're not even teachers, trainers from the private company that are meant to be doing the literacy, numeracy, corrective services were excluded because of COVID. So these poor prisoners then did not have access to, in the majority, there's only 4 jails in New South Wales that have professionally trained, highly qualified adult educators in New South Wales now. We actually were able to capture 4 in that fight to stop that. So most prisoners have not had access to trainers or any literacy numeracy teaching over the last 2 years, and even this year up until this year. So that's a sort of a background on exactly where we are in relation to all the impact of COVID on vocational education in New South Wales, TAFE, private dodgy companies that are ripping people off at this time of year, which is unbelievable, and where we go from there. I think I'm probably running out of time, Peter, so I'll come to conclude with the exploitation of teachers and what does that mean for our students. Again, I won't expose the discipline where this is happening. With the cuts to funding, which again relate to what Michael was saying in relation to you cannot have 10 years of tax cuts and etc. and continue to expect the public sector services won't be diminished. So in TAFE what they're doing is they're taking a teacher and they're trying to work out how do we reduce the cost of that teacher, which honestly it is mad. The value you get, there's been research, just recently there was research that said if you spend $1 on a TAFE college, the community gets $16 return out of that. $16, you spend $1, you get $16 return out of that. So the idea that the cost of TAFE is too great, that's where we're at. So they're trying to break the teacher's job down into bits. What does a teacher do? Okay, well they do teach here, and then they do assessments here, and then they do have, they have to record assessments and roll books and attendance and all that sort of stuff. So what they've done is they've tried to break that into 3 different bits, and they want to pay each bit at a lower rate of pay. So I'll give you an example of what that means. There's a cohort of students who learn in a practical way. They do practice on each other in the first instance, and then customers actually come. I won't say what they're doing to the customers. The customers actually come to the TAFE college, and the students work with real customers, doing whatever they're doing, cooking for them or cutting their hair or whatever. So what TAFE has done is said to this highly qualified teacher, said, we will pay you as a teacher for the first 4 weeks while you've got them and you actually teach them and so on. But then we want you to take them into this practical area with real customers, and because you're not teaching them, which is just madness that they're not teaching them, because they're actually doing assessments while they're working with these customers, we're going to pay you as this lower level of pay called an education support officer, because we can't meet budget. They're not even pretending it's not because of education. They're telling us it's because they can't meet budget. And we said, well, how are you going to make sure, because the job description of this person over here, which is meant to be a different person, but it's actually the same person at a different rate of pay, this person over here, how are you going to make sure that they don't teach? Because it very clearly says that you'll be breaching their job description if they teach. They said, we're going to give them professional development, how not to teach. That's what they said, management said. We're going to give them professional development, how not to teach.
Yes, Minister.
Anyway, it's too funny if it wasn't so sad.
And they've never had any other professional development.
That's right, yeah, we never get any professional. The teachers don't get any professional development not to teach. I'll really quickly go, finalise this. So, as Maxine said, this is pretty demoralising for TAFE teachers. We'd organised for a 3-year pay increase over 2020, 2021, 2022. COVID hit, Perrottet came in and said, and it was all done. TAFE was on side, we were on side. COVID hit, Perrottet said, we're not going to recognise that deal. It was pretty devastating. And what he came back with, after all the angst of that case, came back and those TAFE teachers got 0.3% pay increase, which is basically zero for 12 months. We just got another 2.04, which is an insult again in 2021 in June. So we're now, and as I said, TAFE teachers' working conditions is the learning conditions of our students. We need a significant pay increase and we need a significant decrease in the workload for teachers, and that would include increasing the permanency rate. We currently have around about over 70% of TAFE teachers are casual or on short-term contract, over 70%. The national average, I think, is somewhere in about 18 to 20% casualisation. We're 4 or 5 times above that. I know universities are in the same boat as us. That has to turn around, and that's going to be where we're going to be fighting. We're going to keep on fighting to make sure students get time to learn. We're going to continue to keep on fighting that students get access to practical education online where it's required. and we're going to continue to keep on campaigning against the privatisation of these private, for-profit training organisations that are ripping off students. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks. I have a question for you collectively, and I'm really pleased that we have nurses and midwives here. As a high school principal, throughout COVID, turning up to work every day and having a number of students come on site because they didn't have the capacity to learn from home, as you said, lack of technology, access to technology, inconsistent internet, etc. I could see throughout 2021 the decrease in their resilience, the decrease in their mental well-being. Last Friday, I was fortunate enough to be at the conference that Maxine spoke about at New South Wales Teachers Federation, where Professor Ian Hickey presented some of his findings, Ian Hickey from University of Sydney, around mental health resilience in young people, and he was looking at young people from the ages of 15 to 25. And being an educator and being a parent of somebody who falls into that age bracket, I'm incredibly concerned coming out of what we thought was the pandemic. However, we're not coming out of the pandemic, we're just going into the next wave of it. The resilience, the mental health impacts on our young people are profound, absolutely profound. Giving the kids an app from Headspace or any of those, not that I'm dissing any of those services because they do a great job, it is not adequate to provide young people experiencing that level of distress with a phone app. I'm not going to ask you what the answer is because the answer is a huge injection of funds, but in the short term, I mean, how would you suggest we try to catch these kids? Because Maxine talked about kids, or Rob talked about kids not wanting to come back to school. And then we've seen kids who have come back to school so ill-equipped for the routines of learning because they've just experienced this massive disconnection from the world that they knew. Nothing is certain anymore. I guess it's a really big question. I'd like your thoughts around mental health, young people, and how do we manage that?
Well, I'll start. I'll start.
I'll start.
So,
Well, one wouldn't be, I mean, okay, massive injection of funds, that's good. But one would be absolutely making sure that the current services don't get cut. So I'll give you the, get them in there. But so TAFE right now, TAFE has, and I was just talking to this, one of the teaching consultants for students with a disability, neurological and mental health. And they said, we absolutely cannot give the services that we used to give. So maintaining services is absolute minimum, and we're still talking about cutting services in those areas. So they're talking right now, it's happening right now, so we're expecting a report in the next couple of weeks. They're talking about those experts dealing with students, have a teaching background but have a psychology degree or something as well, dealing with them. They're talking about getting rid of that position and making it a generic clerical position so that they can deal with the nuts and bolts of getting that student in the classroom, not supporting them when they need it. And there's another, and again, this is again not just a cut, this is not talking about cuts, let's just maintain. Traditionally what TAFE has done is those students who needed extra support would get, a teacher would get paid to do what they would call an extra tutorial. So the student would be in their commercial cookery class all day, and then if required and agreed with the teaching consultant for students with neurological or mental health issues, they would get funded to be with the teacher at another time to catch up on some of the stuff they did, which is a brilliant idea. Well, that's not happening either. And one of the reasons that's not happening is because we don't have enough teachers. And so when this woman was telling me, this was just on Thursday, she was just saying, I'm just pulling my hair out, I cannot get enough teachers to do that extra support that used to happen. So not even let's get extra funding, let's at least maintain some of the really good programs that was happening, and they're under attack at the moment as well.
I think the only thing that's going to solve it is a big injection of funds, right? So we know that there's inadequate number of adolescent mental health beds in the state. That means that when you're acutely unwell, the pressure for the nurses and the doctors to get you into a subacute bed because someone else needs that acute bed means that you're shifted into a ward where your unwellness is too high for the rest of that ward and blame staff. And that just pushes on all the way down through to being discharged early back into the community where there's inadequate support. We know that the evidence shows long-term what supports kids is support in schools, and it's not necessarily counsellors, it's about having a teacher's aide in every classroom. It's about doing those fundamental things as preventative measures rather than dealing with it when it's at crisis. So backing what Rob says, that it's maintaining the current services, but actually we just need a big injection. And we're not going to get that whilst ever we've got a neoliberal government of whatever colour who says that tax breaks for big business is the way forward. Actually what we need is a strong revenue base that funds sustainable public services in this country.
I might be a bit braver than you, Julie, and I will put some shit on some of these wellness providers because they're in it for a profit.
Yeah.
And it's not, it's no coincidence that this government embraces this idea of resilience workshops, because it's not the government, hey, it's you. There's something defective in you if you can't cope with this. It's nothing that the government's doing. That's the attitude of blame shifting that this government walked in with, and they come up with no new ideas whatsoever. It is the injection of funds. You know, Julie, as well as I do, that we don't have enough counsellors in our school system, but I also know, having also worked in the public health system, that we've never had enough mental health workers in the state. If I go back to, it must be 30 odd, maybe 35 years ago, when I lived in Wagga Wagga, which was then the biggest inland city in New South Wales, and there was only a visiting psychiatrist. There wasn't even one psychiatrist in the town. Mental health has never had that injection of funds that it's needed, and now it needs that injection of funds on some steroids.
Another question? Okay, Stu, and then we'll get out.
Okay. I'm utterly furious listening to you three up there. I thought my blood was boiling. I'm furious. I was beautifully put all of you. Until Rob said that magnificent thing about the professional development to teach you how not to teach. Look, I was brought up in the age of Monty Python and Spike Milligan, but they had nothing on these guys. However, what I want to ask you is a bit of homework for me and for all of us perhaps. So, what the hell are we going to do about it right now when we go home and going on a little bit? So some nice concrete things, and one of them might be come the hell to our nurses strike and support and come to the table. So I've got that and I'll be doing that. But what, like I say, I like to go out with a little bit of short-term homework and some long-term homework. So, big man.
Okay, well, I'm going to start. I'll start conservatively and let them progress from there. Conversations talking with people, conversation. Our language is powerful. We spoke earlier before we started about stop using the neoliberal language. And there's nothing wrong with being workers and using workers' language. There is nothing wrong with telling people that workers are being screwed. All workers. There is nothing wrong with if you talking to people and saying things such as, well, you know, every time someone talks to me about doing my taxes, I say, I love paying my tax. I should pay more tax. I don't want to minimise my tax because my tax pays for the public health system, the public education system, public housing, and other public services. We need to use our language and have conversations. If that doesn't work, we join the nurses on the streets. If that doesn't work, we all get out on the streets.
Yay!
I got a real practical one. So got a real practical one. So, and for people who are watching this later on, so there's a campaign called Rebuild with TAFE, rebuildwithtafe.com.au. I'd strongly encourage people to go on that. We have a thing going right now coming up to the federal election that's asking people to do their block. And if you're not angry enough now, you've got to do your block. So you can write to the Australian Education Union office in Melbourne, asking them for some flyers. And if you want to, we'll let you decide what postbox you're going to put it into. If you live in a marginal federal electorate, that would probably be worthwhile doing it there. If you live close and you want to go over there, but even if you just tell your local community and put some notices in that, so that we're asking people to do their block. And there's also a petition on there. We're very, very concerned. I ran out of time to do this. On the Minister for Education, who is the Dud. The Dud has on his desk at the moment a new 5-year deal to continue this privatisation of vocational education. What a dud. What a dud. So and they're all going for it, same with the state Liberal coalition before that. The Australian Labor Party is saying they're not going to implement that if it's done. So that would be the immediate things I would talk about.
And make sure all young people are enrolled to vote.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would back in both of those. I think no matter where you live, make an appointment to go and see a local politician. You know, one of the problems we've got is that we've got Liberal national politicians who, the Liberals might not be listening, the Nationals are going to increasingly have to listen, particularly given the outcomes of the regional rural inquiry into healthcare in New South Wales. So always worthwhile going to talk to your local politicians. I'd extend what Maxine said about, talk with people. I think ask people questions. What matters to you? What do you think is fair? Things like that. Get them agitated. Give them a point of direction. And I think the final thing I'd encourage people to do as a concrete step is, of course, join your fucking union.
Yay!
We're seeing the union movement pick up in Australia in the public services, and we need that reflected in the private sector as well. I think it's through the trade union movement that people can find kindred spirits that actually take that collective action. So we need more collective action on the streets, and I think that's the way we'll shift it.
Okay.
Can I?
Yes,
Sorry.
Stephen, go ahead.
I think you were talking about myself, were you? I was a nurse, yeah.
Yeah,
You're going to say that, sorry. Look, yeah, I won't turn the camera on myself because that'd be a bit alarming for people. I'm behind the camera if anyone's listening when they watch this online. Yeah, look, my son's a nurse. I was a nurse. My son's a nurse at wherever, it's Canterbury. My daughter's a psychologist at Westmead. Look, yeah, I'm going to drag them physically to watch this when it's televised. I'm sorry they're not here. I didn't realise it was going to be this good, but they wouldn't have listened to me anyway, so they will watch it online, and it's a shame they're not like 2 years old and I can just grab them and physically hold them to do it. But no, I will do my level best. What I was going to, and this is really fantastic, Rob, Maxine and Michael's, thank you. Yeah, what I was going to ask was, like, when I think of somewhere where there is some sort of a good system, there's not this constant war of attrition taking place, and fighting back, and just your whole thing taken up on trying to hold the line somehow, and spend, as you said, the first hour trying to shift everyone about. Like I remember that from the nursing days as well. Shift everyone about to so there's some minimal coverage, If you look at some other countries, some other system, I always think of Finland, and I think of that film Who's to Invade Next with Michael Moore. That, like, you get some sort of a glimpse of what a good system might be like, and like this gentleman from Wolverhampton, near Wolverhampton, Birmingham. All right, Wednesbury. Yeah, I saw on television like a few weeks ago this Birmingham maternity hospital, big maternity hospital. You saw the calibre of those people, fantastic at the ground level, fantastic people, like people you'd love to know, like the ones you've all worked with. You see them at that level, and then you see the people at the top. We didn't see them in the programme, but you know the people like Boris Johnson at the top, they're assholes. Now how does this happen? We have people with fantastic people skills, brilliant people there, and yet people directing them or have some sort of managerial thing are idiots. I mean, we know the reasons, we know how the logic of the system works, but we need to understand this is not how it should be. And what I was saying, can you look at another place, another country, another system where things work in a way that's sort of tolerable, that's not a constant struggle? I'm sure there's struggle and tensions everywhere, but something that looks like, that's what we would like.
I wouldn't nominate a country, but a system. I don't think you can beat socialism myself. I think that a system where we make sure that everybody has what they need, and those who can help those in need when they need it. I think a system whereby we ensure that everyone's basic needs are met and more. That they don't have to choose between having a meal on the table and having an operation for their hip replacement. We need to go back to the basics of dignity and respect in the workplace.
Yeah.
We need to have the injection of funds to lift people up to a standard higher than the one that we accept now. We need to tax the rich. We need to look at corporate ownership. We need to look at, we once looked at ships with flags of convenience. Stop looking at ships, look at it all now. I say, bring on, well, we're here. Bring on the revolution. In a peaceful and orderly fashion.
Yeah, well, no, seriously, you don't want, there are things you don't want to do. Sorry.
I'm a retired community nurse.
Good.
I just want to know how your morale is, how your workplace is, how well supported you are in your relationship with teachers, with people in the unions. Because, there needs to be a fighting spirit. I hear it from you. You're able to maintain that somehow or other. I don't know. I just want to hear something about what it's like working within the unions. If you're able to talk about it, I hope you are.
No, come on.
Well, I would never write the enterprise agreement that I'm working under, I'll tell you that. Because here it is Sunday and I'm working. And, But, look, the Teachers Federation is an extraordinary union. The people who came before us set it up in such a way that it can't be ruled by one particular faction. There are contingency rules that, we are a clearly democratic organisation, and boy, that takes up a lot of time. You can't do anything fast because it has to go through its democratic processes. We have sometimes heated discussion, debate on the floor of our council. And I believe that's what keeps us strong. I believe it's that considered debate and the democracy. And, you know, from time to time, all unions ebb and flow. As the General Secretary of the Teachers Federation, my aim is to make sure that we have absolute transparency and absolute grassroots decision making. And so therefore, my role is simply to administer the will of the members. I think that I'm looked after by the calibre of membership that we have. The will of the members is a reasonable will. Sometimes I wish it wasn't.
It's abstract, I'm sure. It's always been.
But you know, look, all unions are unions in more than just name. We have an ethos where we look after one another, each other, even amongst the union movement. There's solidarity in the union movement at the moment, and there absolutely is. And how can you not feel buoyed by that?
I think, you know, when I look at the workforce of the officers that work for the Nurses and Midwives Association, we see the same things that we see in the workplace. People working really long hours, people are exhausted. We hear absolutely horrific stories from our members, and you can, you know, that really hits hard. I think when I look amongst my peers, what's inspiring is the ability to turn that round into energy to make sure that we work harder to get the system fixed. And I think that taking a lot of inspiration from the membership at the moment, that despite what they've been through, they're willing to down tools, lose a day's pay to go out and fight for a better healthcare system. You know, that's inspiring stuff. There's no doubt there are challenging times because we have a political system and an economic system that is geared against us. So it's a massive fight that we're up against. But when I look around the trade union movement at the moment, I think there's a definite shift. And we are seeing a willingness to take that on that hasn't been around, I would say, for the last 10 years. Not because of the previous leadership, but because of the context that's shifted. I think the broader community can see that the way the system is run at the moment is failing ordinary people. And more people are starting to turn around and actually fight for something better. So that's inspiring stuff.
I'll just real quick in relation to morale, which was a really good question. So the Teachers Federation 8 times a year flies teacher members into Sydney on a Saturday, and about 250 to 300, as Maxine said, grassroots teachers on the ground vote on what the union's going to do. So that happens 8 times a year, and then in July we have 3 days where there's about 600 members. So it is incredibly democratic, and it's, as Maxine is now responsible for that, incredibly difficult to administer democracy. That's good. But the last Saturday, I think, was it? I've never seen teachers so emotional. 2 teachers, I think maybe, well, at least 2, 4 people in their speech in relation to not, and it wasn't about their working conditions, it was about their students. Just cried in front of 300 people. Now that's complex. No one really wants to do that, eh? Just stand up and start speaking, and all of a sudden you start burst out crying. So morale is really, really difficult, and how we support each other is really important. But how the government starts listening to that, particularly in these critical 3 areas for our community, how the government responds to that will be really vitally important in the next 12 months, and vitally important for us as stewards, saying what are we going to do for us to influence their decisions on that.
Yeah. Thank you for your work.
Yeah,
We've come to 3:30 or so I think we will wind up this part of the discussion, but don't run away, get another drink, whatever. I'd just like to thank again Maxine, Rob and Michael for their contributions, and Give them another round of applause.
Thank you.